Good morning and welcome to Pellowe Talk. I'm Dave Pellowe, and joining me today is Professor David Flint. Professor Flint is Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Technology in Sydney. He's also the former Chairman of the Australian Press Council as well of the World Press Council. Professor Flint, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure, thank you.
How are you finding the weather in Cairns this weekend?
Well, it's delightful. It's not too hot and it's not humid, so I'm very happy with it.
Very good. Now, I'm really interested in the book you recently wrote, published by Connocourt, Give Us Back Our Country. What are the major points that you are advocating in that book?
Well, at the end, after a large amount of political advocacy, at the end I argued that we are in a mess in Australia, that there is no significant problem in Australia which, if it were not created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them. Something is wrong. Representative democracy has been captured, and we are in the process of seeing an extraordinarily centralised federation, more centralised than any other federation in the world. Not what was intended, because of a coalition of politicians and activist judges. And what we needed to do was to repeat the process by which we federated. And we federated by deciding that leaving it to the politicians would result in no federation. We would end up 6 independent countries, and that wasn't good. We really needed to be one nation on one continent. And what happened in 1892 at Cora was that it was proposed by John Quick that what should happen is there should be a directly elected convention. But instead of sending back the constitution, it finally drafted, after wide consultation, to the parliaments of the 6 colonies, send it directly to the people, let the people decide by way of referendums. And that did in fact happen. In fact, the whole thing happened in 4 short years. That's
a marvellous achievement in such a short period of time, to get such a consensus across the nation.
Yes, and to get it also through the Imperial Parliament.
Wow.
There was no problems there, apart from some minor points. But it was got through and done in 4 years. And it was done without any violence, without war, without killings, without uprisings. This was an extraordinarily sophisticated thing, of which we should be very proud, but unfortunately about which the children of this country know very little, mainly because of the way in which we've allowed the schools to decline, we've allowed education to decline, as you have so well argued.
Now, you argue for a reform of the political parties. What do you think needs to change in the way we run political parties in Australia?
I think there should be no control, no state control over the political parties, but the political parties receive an enormous cornucopia of legal and financial privileges. Whether those continue is another matter. But in return for the exemptions they get from the laws, yes, privacy laws in relation to the Electoral Act, they can build up databases on you and all of your viewers, which no private corporation could ever do. And they get exemptions from the Electoral Act. Their access, for example, to the electoral roll, which has been secreted away, you can't get at it as you used to be able to. And also they receive rivers of gold. They get money for each first preference vote. Extraordinary amount of money. Whether they should get that is another question. I don't think they should, but anyway, they're getting it. But in return for that, they should have to do something, as anybody else has to do if they get money from the Commonwealth or advantages from the Commonwealth. In return for that, they should move not into the 21st century, they should move into the 20th century.
At least.
Yes, as most parties have in most of the Western world. They should be open, transparent and democratic. Open, transparent and democratic, which they're not. They are now, at the moment, under the control of cabals of power brokers, even power brokers who are lobbyists, which is an extraordinary thing. I think it's extraordinary that that is tolerated. And the result is that candidates all over this Commonwealth are being chosen for serious political office, not on merit, as they should be, as they are in most countries. And if you leave it to the people, the large number of electors and so on, supporters or members of the party, not being chosen on merit, they're being chosen for loyalty to a power broker. And what do they do when they're in office? They act in self-interest, and their self-interest is to do what their patron power broker tells them to do, unless they switch loyalties to another power broker, which they sometimes do. And if the power broker is also a lobbyist, there's a danger there, surely, of corruption.
Yes.
So that's the first point.
On reforming political parties, you mentioned something last night at the Cairns New State forum, which I thought was very interesting, and I really wasn't aware of it. But explain to me how the Israeli parliament elects, or their parties elect their leaders.
Well, the Qd party, which is the bigger party, and Israel, because it has proportional representation, has a large number of parties, much more than here. It's not just two major parties or coalitions. In Israel, there's a large number of parties. The Qd party at the moment is the dominant party, and Mr. Netanyahu is the prime minister, and a very, very forceful prime minister. Now, he's chosen by the whole party membership. Not like here, where we leave it to this cabal, this small group in the so-called party room, the caucus of the Liberal Party, and they do deals with one another. Oh, if you vote for me, I'll make you minister for X.
Right.
All sorts of advantages are given, and I'll look after your pre-selection. So deals are done.
That sounds like a wonderful way to permanently take the power out of the hands of the parties trying to self-reform, and we can impose upon them a reform which prevents this revolving door of prime ministers and national sovereignty risk that we've had for so long.
The same with the Canadian party. They hold a convention.
Brilliant.
At which the leaders...
party members.
And the leader can come from outside.
Wow.
Outside of Parliament. Outside of Parliament, and then they find a seat for him.
Wow.
So it works very well. And of course we know the American system, where it's not restricted to the party, because the party... And I found that in Queensland. I've heard of cases where the party has expelled a member of the party merely because, they didn't say this, but it was merely because they were inviting people like Tony Abbott to come and speak at functions.
Wow.
This is, in the United States, they've gone one step further, and they have primaries of registered supporters in most states. And this has resulted in the election of President Trump, because he dominated in the primaries. Yep. This is a very democratic way of doing it, but we must take power away from these small groups who are doing deals amongst one another, who are doing things not in the national interest. They're doing it in their own interest, self-interest.
Now, another point you make in your book is that you would like to see a device or a method by which citizens can initiate a referendum.
Yes, this is very important, and this is, I think, the feature of one of the most successful countries in the world, that is Switzerland. This is important not only in the quality of governance, it's important also in the way in which we spend our money. And there is very clear evidence, there's no time to explain what it is, there's very clear evidence that this massive duplication of resources and the waste and over-regulation, that this costs us somewhere between 10 to 21% of the GDP.
Wow, that's immense.
Yes, this is about 100...
That would pay off our debt in what?
A couple of years. Well, if it's 21%, that's about $350 billion, not once, $350 billion a year. And that report... The Toomey Withers report of 2007 to the premiers demonstrated that if we cleaned up our federation, not to something mythical, if it just went back to what it was intended to be before the judges, the activist judges and the politicians changed it, we would then save 10%. And that would cleanse things, but there's been further reports which show that the amount of regulation is so much that there's probably another 10%. It may well be duplicated in those figures, we don't know, but it's certainly a lot of money. And if we could say just save 200 billion in 1 year, and in a few years, in 3 years, we'd clean up the debt, and then we'd have money to do things like drought-proofing the nation, the sort of things that governments should be doing.
So how does a citizens-initiated referendum model look like, and what kind of things do you think we would achieve with it?
The model's simple. If you take the Swiss model, for example, there has to be a petition of a certain number of electors, signed by a certain number of electors. You can have a percentage of electors or a certain number. It has to be reasonable, and it's used in two ways, either to initiate referendums or in some American states to recall, which is another of the R's I mentioned.
We'll come back to that.
And the petition would be, say, 5%, 10% of the electorate. Now, that's not something easy. People don't like to do that.
No.
They will only do it if they're committed, because their names have to go onto a public document, so they know who the people are. So you have to have a degree of courage and commitment to do that. But it does happen. It works in Switzerland, where every 3 months in Switzerland, there are national referendums, there are cantonal, that is state referendums, and there are local referendums.
Every 3 months?
Every 3 months. Whole string of them. You don't have to vote, though.
Oh, well, optional voting, that's good. There's a number of Australians who would hate to go to the polls every 4 times a year.
And because they have a secure system, it's not open to fraud. Ours is open to fraud, our electoral system.
How do they achieve security of their system?
Well, ours is deliberately open to fraud. That was introduced in the 80s.
Simply voter ID?
Well, yes, voter ID, but your registration, where you're living, is registered. And there are ways to secure this. In the same way that there are ways to secure your credit card. The amount of fraud is smallish compared with the potential for electoral fraud in Australia, which is deliberately introduced and is deliberately kept there because the parties think that they can be advantaged by it. But it is a very secure system, and every 3 months they have these wonderful things. And they're not like the New Zealand ones. They're not just persuasive. These are mandatory. And some things have to be referred to the people. For example, entering...
So you mean mandatory for the government to adhere to?
For example, if the government wanted to enter into a major treaty, to enter into an international organisation, they would have to put it to the people first. So this global migration compact, which was secretly negotiated by the Turnbull government, which would have then tied the hands the future government, so they couldn't have done what Tony Abbott did and turn back the boats. They would then be able to say, oh, we can't do this because we're bound by an international treaty not to do this.
Yeah.
So this is a marvellous system. So we should have citizen-initiated referendums and even mandatory referendums.
Tell me about the return, the ability to recall politicians. How extensive is that theory?
It's more used in the United States than elsewhere. It does exist in one Canadian province. It did exist in Switzerland. I think it may well still exist on paper, but because of the predominance of citizen-initiated referenda, it is not needed. The political class is very different in Switzerland. They tend quite often to be part-time. They don't surround themselves with vast numbers of advisors. They live very ordinary lives. They don't regard themselves as being endowed with special abilities and competencies like our politicians. And they don't spend a lot of time on television lying to the people, as they so often do in Australia. So the system has created a new political class which is not that much separate from the general population. We have created something like an aristocracy living at Versailles, and that's not what that doesn't result in good governance. If it resulted in good governance, well, it'd be a price worth paying, but it's not a price worth paying, as we know. So the recall election is quite simple. It just requires a petition with a certain percentage of the electors. There are different variations on this, but I won't go into the details. What it just means is that they can call for a new election in relation to a specific seat or chamber, or even perhaps the president or the governor. So you could adopting it to Australia, say, well, it could be the whole House of Representatives, or for example, the Legislative Assembly of a given state, or it could be just a specific person in Parliament.
Wow.
It would mean there would have to be a new election. And that happens.
And that would be achieved by another petition.
That petition would lead to a vote on whether there should be a new election, and quite often a simultaneous election in case that succeeded.
Yes.
So that's the way they handle it in many states. It's more the existence of that.
Yes.
That controls the situation, because politicians then know that if, for example, they do something very silly, that they may well find that the electorate says, no, you're not going to do that.
I think that's absolutely brilliant, especially in Queensland, where we have no legislative assembly, no upper house, keeping the lower house accountable. Essentially what we have are fixed-term, democratically elected dictatorships with no accountability. And the politicians are very comfortable making extreme changes to the state early in their term, hoping that the electorate forgets by the next election, as they so often do. But making incredibly unpopular decisions early on could in fact unseat a particular person, or in fact the whole government, if we forced to go back to an election.
Yes. Now it doesn't always happen, doesn't happen often, and the result is not always one which brings down a government.
But it's like the sword of Damocles. Just the threat of possibility may provide a little bit more responsible government.
It makes politicians accountable 24/7 in the way that they're not. They're accountable in the way that anybody employed is accountable, anybody in business or in practicing a profession is accountable, because your clients, your patients, can turn off if you're not good at what you're doing. In the same way, your employer might decide, well, you're not really performing, and I'm afraid I'll have to get rid of you. So the politicians have this over them, as everybody else has.
Yeah.
And why shouldn't they?
One of the things that makes politics unbearably inefficient and corrupt is delayed consequences or lack of consequences. To not feel the pain of bad decisions is a breeding ground for corruption and incompetence.
Yes, for example, when the Turnbull government introduced or decided to attack their base, that is the self-funded retirees.
Yes.
That created enormous upset, not only among those who are on a pension, but those on their own self-funded pension, but those who were planning to do that. And that would have included most of what Menzies called the forgotten people.
Yes.
Farmers, small business people, independent people, people who are not in big unions, people who are not big business people. These are the rank and file, these are the heart, as it were, of the Liberal Party and the National Party.
Now, you've mentioned several times in our conversations already a topic that's very dear to my heart and to yours as well, and that is the return to federalism. You mentioned the High Court judges and the High Court itself, which over the period of our federation has become quite activist, and Professor James Allen frequently refers to the gross inclination of the High Court to side with the Commonwealth any time a case comes before them, or nearly every time a case has come before them where the states' rights have competed with the Commonwealth. And so we've drifted, as you've described, so much further away from the federation that was designed for us, and we've become the most centralised government of any federation in the world.
There's no doubt about that. We are the most centralised. No other federation is as centralised as we are, and that wasn't the intention of the founders, and most importantly, it wasn't the intention of the people, and the people have been asked to give more powers to the Commonwealth, and they have refused. When I was writing a book for the 1999 referendum on the politicians' republic, it wasn't a real republic, it was a fake republic by fake Republicans for a fake reason, but that's another question. What I was asked, well, what if we win this referendum and they have another referendum? How likely is it that having lost the first referendum, they might win the next? So I checked on the number of repeat referendums, and I found there was about 7 subjects which the Commonwealth had put to the people more than once. In fact, in a few cases, they'd put the same question, the same subject, which they wanted to Canberra to have, they'd put that same subject to the people 5 times, 5 times. And on every occasion, the people had said no. And when I was looking at it, it dawned on me, apart from questions relating to the the nexus, that is the relationship between the Senate and the House, that sort of purely structural question. In relation to the handing over of powers to Canberra, I found that on every occasion the people had said no up to 5 times, and yet it would no longer be necessary to have those referendums again. Why? The High Court had given those powers effectively to Canberra. Quite outrageous. They, for example, decided that the external affairs power effectively allows the Commonwealth, without even Senate approval, as in America, the Commonwealth can enter into any treaty it wants to, and then, according to the High Court, it can then legislate to give effect to that treaty.
Wow.
So there's a great incentive for the Commonwealth to enter into all those UN treaties which give global governance, create global governance.
Yes.
Enter into them, and then the Commonwealth can then legislate in that area, even though the clear intention of the Constitution is that this remain a state matter, and the people, when they have been consulted, have always said no. Yet the High Court said, we can't take into account those earlier referendums. They've said this. We can't take this into account. We don't know what the people really intended there. It's not clear. Therefore, we're going to give the Commonwealth this additional power.
Describe for us what the Founding Fathers had in mind for what the power of states would look like, what the nature of states would look like, how we came about, you know, in an overview, what the Commonwealth should look like. I think a lot of people have lost the concept. Certainly, it's never been taught in schools in recent decades that the states are meant to be sovereign and self-governing and different from the others.
Yes.
Instead, we've become incredibly homogenized and centralized.
You're absolutely
Equalized.
right. Yes, you're absolutely right. The intention was that these states, which were self-governing, the British made the states self-governing. The British kept external affairs and defence, but essentially the states ran their own affairs. They were called colonies then. The intention was that this would continue, but certain very important powers would go to the new federal parliament. For example, immigration was one. Immigration was taken from the British, and because the British were very open with immigration, and there's no doubt that at the time of Federation there was a great wish on the part of, particularly the Labour Party, to stop immigration from outside of Britain and particularly from Asia. And they used that power. That was one power they wanted. It's usually suppressed, that people don't talk about it, but that was the power they wanted because the British were far too liberal for the colonists. The other thing that they wanted particularly was defence, because they could see that the Germans were circling. There's a very clear intention of the Germans to establish a worldwide empire.
This was in the late 19th century?
And much more authoritarian. Although it was nothing like what happened after the First World War. It was still a more authoritarian system than exists among the English-speaking countries. So they were very wary, and they saw the need for defence. They were also wary of Japan. Although Japan was a British ally, the colonists were suspicious of Japan because Japan was soon to be able to demonstrate after Federation that she was able to defeat a European power, which hadn't happened for some years in the Russian-Japanese War. They knew the Japanese were becoming very powerful. They could sift that out.
Yes.
The British saw them as a natural ally of the British. So this was something that they very much insisted be handed to this new authority. But it was to be a government, a parliament of limited powers. Only those powers in the Constitution. There was a list of them. Some are exclusive. Very few are exclusive to the Commonwealth. The others are to be shared with the states on the basis that if there were a conflict between state and federal law, the federal law would prevail. But the idea was always also, and they were very well-read men. They were all men at the time. Then no doubt they were receiving contributions from women, their wives, and other people were telling them, giving them advice. But they were very well aware of what was happening in the world, and they knew that a fundamental principle of federalism, modern federalism, as discovered by the Americans, was that that a state have to have its own income so that it could go to its people and say, this is how we raised your money and this is how we spent it. What we've got now in Australia is complete confusion. Nobody knows who's responsible for what.
Yep.
You had, for example, the other day, the Leader of the Opposition saying because there was some advertising beamed onto the Opera House, that if he were Prime Minister, he would stop it. As if a Prime Minister should have any authority over an asset of New South Wales.
Right, right.
Absolutely ridiculous,
yes.
But that's how Prime Ministers today think. They think everything should be done by Canberra. We suffer.
Exactly.
We suffer from this idea that's been given to us by the politicians. If there's a problem, any problem in Australia, you solve it in two ways. You make the solution uniform so that the competitive federalism can never exist in Australia. You have a centralised solution and you throw money at it. Two things, any problem, which we're doing with education, school education at the moment, and it's a disaster.
I had a frustration with my local public school, and the head of senior had the audacity to suggest that if I had a complaint about the education system, I should vote for a party that would make sure more funding was received for the broken system.
And as you know, with more money flowing in it, the standards have fallen further and further, as you rightly said the other night, in one respect lower than that of Kazakhstan, and certainly lower than that of the countries to the north, because they're using traditional methods of education with sound syllabuses and so on.
Yes.
Curriculum.
So, you and I were invited to speak at the Cairns New State Forum last night. Tell me your thoughts. Tell our viewers who didn't make the meeting and maybe haven't seen the video. What do you think should happen with regards to a new state if the North Queenslanders so prefer? And what other renovations should we make to federalism in Australia to return us to the way the Founding Fathers intended it to be?
And people should watch that video, and they should watch your video, because you taught principle, but you taught it in a very amusing way. And that entertained people, and you got through the message, so that's important. It is important that interpretations of the High Court be subject to review by the people, because the High Court has taken the Constitution away from what it was intended.
Right.
Mr. Trump has another solution, that is he's appointing strict lawyers who will interpret the Constitution as it was intended to mean, not adding in all sorts of myths into the Constitution.
Interpretive activism.
Yes. But it's important that the High Court not be the final.
Wouldn't it be marvellous if the Conservative parties in Australia nominated conservative, well-valued, well-principled people to positions of importance?
It would be wonderful, and that's what they should have done. The last time they did this was the appointment of Ian Callanan to the High Court, because he was a strict constructionist, and of course we now have a retirement age in the High Court, and he's lost to the High Court.
Terrible.
But the idea that 7 men and women wearing black gowns, and when they changed their robes from the traditional wig and gown to an American-style robe, that was a signal they were going to become even more activist, which they did.
Interesting.
And we have to, in Switzerland, it's forbidden for the equivalent of the High Court to even interpret the Constitution.
Marvellous.
And the reason is because the people have such power to change the Constitution if they wish, at any time. And they do it every 3 months, or they can do it every 3 months, and they can make significant changes to the Constitution, which is very important. We have to return to federation. And in North Queensland, there's been a very long tradition of the people of North Queensland wanting separation. What we're seeing in the states, although the states are emasculated by Canberra, they're not real states. They are puppets of Canberra in so many respects. But what we're also seeing is excessive centralisation, particularly in the eastern states, in the capital cities, because so much of the population has grown through excessive rates of immigration, including welfare immigration. Governments seem to have gone in for that rather than looking for quality immigration.
Yes, yeah.
But we have this excessive development of southeast Queensland, the Sydney Basin and Melbourne, and this has meant that more seats have been awarded to those areas and taken away from places like North Queensland, which means that they have less influence, particularly in a one-chamber parliament in Queensland. The people of North Queensland are finding that their vast resources are being diverted away from North Queensland for the benefit of building roads or whatever they're doing in Brisbane.
Yes.
Instead of being used for the benefit of the people here. They have vast resources, not only the mineral resources, they also have these vast water resources, which if the politicians did perform one of their principal functions, which should be to drought-proof this country, they would be using the waters of the north, which flow into the sea. Those would be used and brought down through dams and pipes into the Murray-Darling, turning that into the breadbasket, not only of Asia but also the world. They would do that, and the people of North Queensland would get the benefit from that by selling that.
Do you think a new state of North Queensland is economically viable?
Without doubt. In those federations, all the other federations in the democratic world, Germany, Switzerland, Canada, the United States, North Queensland would more than eclipse a number of the smaller states in those federations in terms of population, size, wealth, all of the criteria you could think up for the minimal size. They could do that, and they're proposing that it include the central part of Queensland, at least initially. It would be a very viable state and a very rich state, and it could perform very well. I suggested that they also incorporate into their constitution provisions which would ensure that you wouldn't have developed in North Queensland a separate aristocracy, a political class living apart from the people, driving around in cars, surrounded by enormous numbers of advisors and being completely isolated.
It's a marvellous opportunity to start with a fresh canvas.
Yes, and I think they should. They shouldn't just copy what's happening. They should also have an upper house. I say it should be called a Senate, as in the United States, rather than a legislative council, because people associate councils with garbage, not what's just said there, and what's collected, what they collect. And it should have a more distinguished name, and everybody understands an upper house is a Senate. The Senate is an upper house, and I think you need that check and balance, and it could be elected in a different way to the way the lower house would be elected. They don't have to be large. I would suggest also you have they ought to have a provision in the Constitution limiting the size of the cabinet. It should be no more than 7. This idea of having a cabinet of 20 in a state is ridiculous. 20, and then they have all these sub or assistant ministers, and the result is there's a lot of effective graft because people do deals about decisions they make if they in turn get an assistant ministership or something like that, and that is corrupting, and it's not the sort of way to govern a state.
It seems like a very novel idea on the face of it, but when given careful consideration, I think it has not only a great deal of excitement, but a great deal of merit.
Yes, and we have experience which demonstrates that this works, particularly in Switzerland. There's no need, of course, for Australia to become to change from being a constitutional monarchy. It all fits within the constitutional monarchy. For example, they have recall elections in one of the Canadian provinces. You can do this. In Canada, the leader of the party is chosen by a convention of the Conservative Party, for example, which is the principal party, and that can be done. It all fits in with the constitutional monarchy. You don't have to move away from Westminster. If there were real Republicans, they would learn, particularly from the United States, and they'd be arguing for an executive presidency and executive governorships. That would be an interesting argument. But of course they don't, because they're not real Republicans. They're fake Republicans.
Very interesting.
Or wanting a fake republic, because none of the republics ever proposed a real republic. They're fake republics. That is a republic for an ulterior purpose. The very first one proposed in Australia was in the 19th century, and that was to create a white republic. It was just to arrange the immigration rules.
Wow.
That's all. It was the Bulletin who led that, the big newspaper in Sydney at the time. And every other one has been for a fake republic. And they do it for a fake reason. That is, they claim we don't have an Australian as head of state. Shorten says that. But Shorten also belonged to a government which held out Quentin Price as the head of state. The head of state is only a diplomatic term relating to international law rules and conventions relating to vice-regal, royal and presidential travel. That's all it is, nothing more than that. And they've taken that and they've tricked the people into believing that this is a real reason to impose their fake republic, which is to increase the power of the political class. That was the last one. The one in 1999 was to impose on Australia a fake republic, a politician's republic. It would have been the only one in the world, in history, where the Prime Minister could have sacked the President without notice, without any grounds whatsoever, and without any right of appeal. Now, why were they doing that? That was to put in place a puppet who would do the Prime Minister's bidding.
Yeah.
It would be to increase the Prime Minister's powers.
Yeah, terrible. I could listen to you forever. It's enthralling hearing you describe our federation, our legal systems, and the opportunities for improvement or return to the authenticity that was first captured.
And we can do it. We can do it. And North Queensland could be an example of doing it, or might result from it being done.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Pellowe Talk. Don't forget, I can be deplatformed at any time, so make sure you go to the website and subscribe to the emails. That's davepellowe.com. And if you can head over to the donate page and contribute to the next article or episode, I'd be very, very grateful. It helps me keep doing stuff like this. So if you get anything out of it, please consider becoming a partner for as little as $5 a month. We've also got some merchandise there that will also help continue. One-off donations are great. Now, make sure you've liked and followed the page on Facebook, and if you're on YouTube, make sure you not only subscribe to the channel, but click the little bell icon, which makes sure you get notified of every new video that gets published. And in the meantime, I look forward to seeing your comments below the video and the post on my website so we can keep the conversation going.